The land had been sitting empty for 11 years before anyone thought to do anything about it. It was a stretch of Muskeg north of Lac La Biche, about 300 acres of what most people in the county called the drain. Spruce trees that had drowned standing up, black water that didn't move, mosquitoes so thick in summer that they blurred the air. The provincial land registry listed it as Category 4 wetland, which was a polite way of saying it was worth almost nothing. The previous owner, a grain farmer named Elwood Strite, had inherited it from his father and spent 20 years trying to tile drain it before finally giving up and moving to Lethbridge. When he left, he didn't even bother listing it for sale. He just stopped paying taxes on it. The county eventually took it over and quietly forgot it existed. Nobody wanted the drain. Nobody except Fletcher Novak. Fletcher Novak was 52 years old when he first walked out onto that land in the early October of 2011. He was 6 feet and 1 inch tall, though he stood slightly hunched in the way of men who have spent decades bending over things. Engine blocks, fence lines, seed rows. His hair was the color of iron filings, close cropped on the sides and longer on top, where it pushed forward in a natural wave he never tried to fix. His hands were large and permanently darkened at the knuckles. His face was square and deeply lined around the eyes, not from age so much as from years of squinting into flat northern light. He had a scar along his left jawline from a tractor accident at 19 that had healed white and smooth, and people who met him for the first time often found themselves staring at it longer than was polite. He'd grown up 40 kilometers east of there, outside a hamlet called Owlhead that doesn't appear on most maps. His father had run a mixed operation, barley, canola, a small beef herd, and Fletcher had taken over at 26 after his father's first stroke. He'd kept the farm going for almost 2 decades, through drought years and low commodity prices, and a second stroke that took his father completely. When his mother passed in 2007, he sold the home quarter and most of the equipment, paid off what was owed, and found himself with a small amount of money, no land, and no particular plan. For 4 years, he worked for other people. Custom combining, fencing, a winter driving fuel trucks on the oil patch roads. He was not unhappy, exactly, but there was something in him that had gone quiet in a way that didn't feel right. He had never been a man who talked much, but there is a difference between a man who is quiet because he is at peace and a man who is quiet because he has lost the thread of something. Fletcher was the second kind, and he knew it. He first heard about the Lac La Biche parcel from a woman at the county land office named Patricia Welk, who mentioned it almost as an aside while he was inquiring about an entirely different property. She said the county was looking to offload a few non-productive parcels, liability concerns mostly, and that some of them were being offered at back tax value. She pulled up the file for Lot 14, Range 13, slid it across the counter and said, "Fair warning, this one is basically a pond." Fletcher looked at the file for a long time. He drove out that same afternoon. What he found was not encouraging, at least not on the surface. The access road was 2 tire ruts through willow scrub, barely passable in his half-ton. The land itself was lower than the surrounding fields by what he estimated was 4 to 6 feet. A broad, dark depression that held water in irregular pools, connected by channels of slow-moving muck. The spruce that had managed to survive stood in clusters on slightly elevated hummocks, their roots black and exposed. A great blue heron lifted off as he pushed through the willow fringe, its wings slow and enormous in the gray October air. Somewhere in the water, something moved. Most people would have turned around. Fletcher Novak stood at the edge of the Muskeg for nearly an hour without moving. He had grown up hearing his father talk about a neighbor, a man named Gustave Lebrun, who had farmed a slough-heavy quarter section in the 1960s and done something unusual with it. Instead of draining it, Gustave had leaned into the water. He'd dug channels, built low earthen berms, let the natural hydrology do what it wanted. He'd grown wild rice. He'd kept a few hundred ducks. He'd done something with watercress that no one fully understood, but that apparently earned him more per acre than anyone in the county growing wheat. Fletcher's father told that story with a kind of reluctant admiration, the way farmers sometimes talk about men who broke the rules and didn't suffer for it. Fletcher had carried the story without knowing he was carrying it. Standing at the edge of the drain, he thought about Gustave Lebrun. He bought the land for $11,000. His neighbor at the time, a man named Ed Polzin, who ran a large grain operation east of town, heard about the purchase and called Fletcher directly. Ed Polzin was not a mean man. He was the kind of man who believed in facts and straight lines and things that could be measured. He had farmed for 30 years without losing money, which was an achievement, and it had given him a certain confidence in his own judgment. "Fletcher," he said over the phone, "what in the hell do you think you're going to do with Category 4 Muskeg?" Fletcher thought about it for a moment. "I'm not sure yet," he said. There was a pause on the line. "That's not a good enough answer for $11,000. "Probably not," Fletcher agreed. Ed Polzin told the story at the coffee shop in town a few days later, and by the following week it had made the rounds. The general consensus was sympathetic but firm. Fletcher Novak had bought himself a problem. A man named Terence Kowalchuk, who ran the co-op supply, said you'd have better luck farming the bottom of Lesser Slave Lake. A retired agrologist named Bud Friesen shook his head slowly and said he'd seen good men lose money on Muskeg their whole career and never once seen it work out. Someone said Fletcher had never been quite right since selling the home quarter. Someone else said the Novaks had always been a little stubborn that way. Fletcher heard some of this secondhand. He didn't say much in response. He had stopped going to the coffee shop around the same time he bought the land, not because of the talk, but because he had run out of hours in the day. He spent the first winter reading. He ordered books through the interlibrary loan at the county library in Lac La Biche, books on wetland ecology, on northern aquaculture, on peatland hydrology, on the traditional harvesting practices of Cree communities in the boreal region. He read about wild rice cultivation in northern Ontario and Minnesota, about the way natural water systems process nutrients, about the difference between acidic and alkaline bogs, and what each could support. He read slowly and carefully, the way he had always read, making notes in a small spiral-bound notebook with a mechanical pencil. He filled 3 notebooks before spring. He also started visiting the land in winter, when the ground was frozen and he could walk out across the surface that had been impassable in the fall. What he found surprised him. The Muskeg, under snow and frost, had a structure he hadn't been able to see in October. There were patterns to it, subtle ridges and depressions, areas where the water had moved differently, places where the peat had built up, and places where it had scoured away. He walked it in a grid, marking his path on a hand-drawn map. He took soil samples where he could chip through the frost. He noted where the cattails grew thickest, where the sedge grass came in heavy, where the water looked darker or lighter. He was looking for something, though he couldn't have named it exactly. He was looking for what the land was already trying to be. By March, he had a theory. The Muskeg sat at the low point of a larger watershed that drained about 1,200 acres of surrounding agricultural land. That meant nutrient-rich water had been flowing into it for decades. Phosphorus, nitrogen, organic matter from the fields above. The land wasn't depleted. If anything, it was over-enriched, and the natural water chemistry, while acidic in places, had a mid-range pH in the central pools that surprised him. It was not the dead, inert landscape people assumed it to be. It was, in his estimation, extraordinarily alive. It had just never been given a direction. In April, he borrowed a small excavator from a cousin and spent 3 weeks shaping. He was not trying to drain the Muskeg. He was trying to organize it. He deepened some of the natural channels, connecting pools that had been separate. He built low earthen levees, nothing dramatic, just gentle berms that redirected the flow slightly. He created 3 larger open water areas by clearing accumulated debris and dead wood. He left the surrounding hummocks and cattail stands largely intact. When his cousin came out to see the progress after the 3rd week, he stood on the bank and looked out at the modified landscape and said, "Fletcher, I genuinely cannot tell what you've done out here." "I know," Fletcher said. "That's about right." He seeded wild rice that June, Zizania palustris, the northern species suited to boreal conditions. He bought seed from a producer in northern Ontario who'd been growing it for 15 years. Spent an afternoon on the phone with the man learning the specific requirements. Depth, temperature, pH. The way the seedlings need to be submerged just right in the first weeks, or they'll float away. He rented a small aluminum boat and seeded by hand, working the 3 open water areas methodically, the boat rocking slightly in the June warmth. There were no guarantees. Wild rice was finicky, and he was planting in land that had never supported it, in conditions that were approximately right but not perfect. He went home that evening and did not feel confident. He felt something closer to the particular calm that comes after committing to something you cannot take back. He came out every few days through June and July to check the seedlings, pulling the boat along the shallow edges, bending low to look at the water. The first 2 weeks showed nothing. Then, on a warm Thursday morning in late June, he saw the first seedling shoots breaking the surface, thin and pale and impossibly delicate. And he sat in the boat for a long time without moving, the paddle across his knees. By August, the 3 pools were green. It was not a harvest that year. Wild rice takes time to establish, and Fletcher knew this going in. What he was watching in August was whether the plants could survive to set seasonae naturally, which would tell him whether the land could sustain a population year after year without replanting. He watched and waited through the summer. Some plants died, more survived. By September, the seed heads were heavy and dark, bending toward the water. He let them fall. He left them for the ducks. That winter, the word around town was still cautiously skeptical. Ed Polzin heard Fletcher had planted something out there in the Muskeg, but wasn't sure what. Terence Kowalchuk said he'd driven past and couldn't see anything useful. Bud Friesen said you could grow vegetation on a muskeg all day long and not make a cent from it. Fletcher, at the coffee shop he had started occasionally visiting again, drank his coffee and listened and didn't say much. He was already planning for the following spring. The second year brought changes he hadn't anticipated. The restructured water channels had begun, slowly, to do something he had hoped for, but hadn't been certain of. They were drawing down the water temperature gradient in a way that made the central pools subtly warmer in spring and slightly more stable in summer. He didn't have instruments sophisticated enough to measure it precisely, but he could feel it when he reached his hand into the water. A warmth that came earlier than the surrounding wetland, that lingered a little longer into fall. He'd read about this effect in one of the library books, about how moving water through shaped channels could regulate temperature in ways that static ponds could not. That second spring, he made a second decision. He contacted a researcher at the University of Alberta named Dr. Sonia Baca, who specialized in northern wetland ecology and had published papers on boreal peatland restoration. He'd found her name in one of the journal articles he'd read that first winter. He sent her a 2-page letter, handwritten, because that was how he did things, describing the land, what he'd observed, what he'd done, and what he was seeing now. He asked if she might be willing to come and look at it. He didn't frame it as a request for validation. He framed it as a request for a second set of eyes. She came out in May. Dr. Sonia Baca was 38 years old, compact and efficient in her movements, with short dark hair and the particular focused energy of someone who spends most of their time outdoors. She brought 2 graduate students and a set of water quality instruments and spent an entire day on the property. Fletcher walked with her through the morning and then gave her space in the afternoon, which she seemed to appreciate. She took cores from the peat. She measured pH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, water temperature. She counted plant species. At the end of the day, she stood on the main berm Fletcher had built and looked out at the modified landscape in the long evening light. "This isn't how most people approach a property like this," she said. "I know," Fletcher said. "You didn't try to make it something it wasn't. That seemed like a waste of time." She looked at him for a moment and then back at the water. "You've got something interesting here," she said. "I'm not sure exactly what yet, but it's interesting." She sent him a 4-page typed letter 2 weeks later, with her lab results attached. The soil was richer than she'd expected. The water quality, particularly in the central pools, was better than surrounding surface water by most measures. The wild rice population was establishing well, but what caught her attention most was something she'd noticed almost by accident while sampling near the North Channel. The bottom sediment was dense with invertebrate life, midges, water beetles, amphipods, and something she hadn't expected to find this far north in this concentration. She wasn't certain. She wanted to come back in the fall. She came back in September. What, doctor? Bake found in the North Channel in September was a population of freshwater mussels, Anodonta beringiana, the western floater, in numbers she described in her subsequent notes as significant for a modified boreal site. Freshwater mussels were filter feeders. They were also indicators. A population of healthy mussels meant the water was clean enough to support them, and it meant the sediment was stable enough for them to anchor in. They were, in a sense, a report card. They were telling anyone who read them that the water in Fletcher Novak's modified Muskeg had become something different from what it had been before. More practically, freshwater mussels were, in some markets, extremely valuable. Fletcher hadn't known this when he reshaped the channels. He hadn't known mussels would come at all. What he had done was create the conditions that made the land want to produce them. That was a different thing from planning them. It was closer to listening. He sat with that knowledge through the winter. He called Dr. Bake in February and asked her about markets and regulations. He filed the paperwork with Alberta Environment for an aquaculture development permit, which took 7 months and 3 revisions of the application documents. He hired a local lawyer named James Krause for 2 days to review the language. He was methodical about it in the way he was methodical about everything, not rushing, not showing frustration when things moved slowly, just working through the requirements one at a time. The permit came through in the following October. By the 3rd year, the wild rice was self-sustaining. The natural reseeding had worked. The plants had naturalized into the improved pools in a way that required almost no intervention from Fletcher. They were simply part of the land now, the same way the cattails and the sedge were part of it. He harvested that fall for the first time, by boat in the traditional way, bending the stalks over the gunwale and knocking the grain loose. It was slow work, and his back ached for 3 days afterward. He brought in just under 400 kilograms. He drove it to a processor in Plamondon, who cleaned and parched it and bagged it in 5-kilogram lots. The rice sold in 2 weeks. Specialty food stores in Edmonton and Calgary paid a premium for northern-grown wild rice, particularly when it came with a story and a specific origin. Fletcher had a story. He had an origin. He had both. It was not a fortune. But it was proof. He started hearing things differently at the coffee shop that fall. Ed Polzin asked him, casually, looking at his cup, what kind of numbers the rice had produced. Terence Kowalchuk mentioned he'd seen the bags at the store in town and noticed the Lac La Biche label. Bud Friesen, who had been quietly skeptical from the beginning, drove out to the property on a Sunday afternoon and called Fletcher afterward. He said he'd like to come and walk it sometime, if that was all right. Fletcher said it was all right. What Bud Friesen saw on that walk was not what he expected. He was 71 years old, Bud Friesen, a wide man with a white beard, and the broad-shouldered solidity of someone who had been physically strong his whole life and hadn't quite lost it yet. He had spent 40 years as an agrologist, testing soils, advising farmers, watching people try and fail at more schemes than he could remember. He had a built-in skepticism about unconventional approaches that wasn't cynicism so much as accumulated experience. He had seen too many ideas that worked on paper fail on land to believe in ideas that only worked on paper. But what he walked through that October afternoon was not an idea. It was something that was growing and breeding and sustaining itself. The wild rice stood above the water in heavy-seated rows that no one had planted in that particular arrangement. They had arranged themselves, following the natural current patterns of the channels Fletcher had shaped. The pools were clear in a way that Muskeg pools generally weren't, and when they reached the North Channel and Fletcher crouched down and reached into the shallow edge and lifted one of the mussels from the sediment, holding it carefully in his large hand so Bud could see the nacre shining on the inner shell, Bud Friesen was quiet for a long time. "How many?" Bud finally asked. Dr. Baki's last estimate was somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 mature individuals, Fletcher said. "Probably more by now." Bud looked at the mussel, and then at the water, and then at the surrounding land. He had an expression Fletcher had never seen on him before. Not quite surprise, because Bud Friesen had disciplined himself out of surprise over the decades. It was more like recalibration, the particular look of a man who is quietly revising something he thought he knew. "You did this without drainage," Bud said. "You can't drain a watershed," Fletcher said. "You can only redirect it." Bud nodded slowly. He handed the mussel back, and Fletcher set it carefully back in the sediment, angling it the way he'd seen mussels position themselves, facing into the gentle current. They walked the rest of the property in the long, late October light, through the sedge stands and around the wild rice pools, following the low berm to the south end, where the land met the agricultural boundary. Bud asked careful questions about the soil pH, about the permits, about the labor involved, about the market. Fletcher answered each one without embellishment. He didn't exaggerate the numbers or downplay the difficulties. He described what had worked and what hadn't, including the wild rice crop that had partially failed in year 2 due to a late frost, and the permit process, which had been slow and frustrating, and the one channel he'd shaped incorrectly in the first spring and had to rebuild the following year. Bud listened to all of it. At the end of the walk, standing at the access road, Bud looked back at the property. The light was dropping. The water showed between the reed stands in dark strips, reflecting a pale sky. "I told people you'd lost your mind," Bud said. Fletcher nodded. "I was wrong." It was not a dramatic declaration. Bud said it the way an old man admits to a mistake, quietly, without theater, like setting something down that had been getting heavy. Fletcher heard it the same way. He didn't make anything of it. He just nodded again and unlocked the truck. Word traveled in the way that words travel in small communities. Through the coffee shop, through the co-op, through the informal networks of people who had known each other for decades. By the following spring, Fletcher had received 3 phone calls from farmers who owned low-lying parcels they'd never been able to do anything with. One was south of town, 140 acres of slough ground. One was farther east, near the Cold Lake District, an old overflow area from a creek that flooded regularly and couldn't be insured. The third was a woman named Helen Cassidy, who had inherited 50 acres of fen from her father and paid taxes on it for 12 years without knowing what to do. He met with each of them. He walked their land. He looked at the water and the soil and the plant communities, and the way the land held and moved moisture. He didn't promise anything. What he said, to each of them, was that the first question was not what you could do to the land, but what the land was already doing, and whether there was a way to work with that instead of against it. Helen Cassidy, who was 63 and sharp, and had spent her career as an accountant, looked at him during this explanation and said, "That's not how anyone has ever described land to me before." "It's the only way I know how to describe it," Fletcher said. He helped all 3 of them develop plans over the following 2 years. Not the same plan. Different plans, because the land was different in each case. The slough south of town turned out to be suited to waterfowl habitat enhancement, which qualified for a conservation easement that generated annual payments to the landowner. The Cold Lake parcel was more complex. Fletcher connected the owner with Dr. Baki's lab, which was interested in it as a research site, which eventually led to a formal partnership. Helen Cassidy's fen, once they'd done the water quality testing, turned out to have unusual botanical diversity. Several sedge species and a rare club moss variety that a provincial naturalist organization paid to document and protect. None of these were the same outcome as the Muskeg north of Lac La Biche, but all of them were outcomes. All of them were land that had sat unused, classified as a problem, quietly producing something of value once someone had taken the time to look carefully. Fletcher did not start a business from this. He did not consult commercially or charge for his time, at least not in those years. What he did was more like what a person does when they've learned something that matters. He shared it with whoever seemed ready to hear it. He was sitting on the bank of his own North Channel one evening, in late summer, watching the light go flat across the water, when his phone rang. It was his younger sister in Camrose, who called once a month and always asked the same questions. "How's the land? How's your back? Are you eating properly?" He answered the same way he always did. Fine, yes. And then she asked how things were really going, which was the real question, the one she always worked up to. He thought about it for a moment. "It's good," he said. "The rice came in heavy. The mussels are doing well. Bud Friesen brought his grandson out last week to see the channels." "People used to say you made a mistake buying that land," his sister said. "They weren't wrong," Fletcher said. "It was a risk, but it worked out." He looked out at the water. A pair of golden eyes was working the far edge of the rice stand, diving and surfacing, diving and surfacing. The light on the water was the particular amber of a northern evening in late August. "The land worked out," he said. "I just tried not to argue with it." His sister laughed at that, a short, warm sound. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she trusted that he did. He set the phone down after the call and sat for another half hour without moving, watching the golden eyes work the edge of the rice. It was not a dramatic life. It was not a story anyone would have told about him when he was driving fuel trucks on the oil patch roads with a quiet that felt wrong. But it was the right kind of quiet now. The kind that comes from knowing what you're doing and why, from understanding your place in something larger than yourself without needing to explain it to anyone. The land had not been the problem. The problem had been that no one had looked at it long enough to understand what it was asking for. Fletcher Novak had looked, and in looking, he had found something that the county had written off, that the neighbors had laughed about over coffee, that the agrologists had shaken their heads at. Not because it wasn't there, but because no one had been patient enough to see it. Some things take time before they show you what they are. The land knows this. The water knows this. Most people just forget.